In 38 days, the United States conducted the most intensive air campaign against Iran in history. American forces killed Iran's supreme leader, destroyed hundreds of missile sites, and imposed a naval blockade that choked Iranian ports. President Trump declared unconditional surrender the only acceptable outcome. He spoke publicly about blasting Iran back to the Stone Ages. And yet, weeks later, America agreed to release an estimated $24 billion in frozen Iranian assets, permanently lifted oil sanctions, ended its naval blockade, and signed a document that leaves Iran's enrichment question unresolved for another 60 days. How does a country that loses a war emerge with this outcome? The answer is not about what happened on the battlefield. It's about what Iran revealed before the first strike even landed. A pressure point so structurally embedded in the global economy that military power alone could not neutralize it. Most coverage focused on the bombs, but the real negotiation began the moment Iran closed a 21-mile-wide waterway and the world economy started screaming. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched coordinated strikes on Iran targeting nuclear sites, military leadership, and missile infrastructure. Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, was killed. Iran responded by attacking U.S. bases across the region and critically closing the Strait of Hormuz, through which approximately 20% of the world's oil and gas normally flows. Oil prices surged. Global shipping insurance premiums spiked. By late March, Brent crude had reached $114 per barrel. After weeks of back-and-forth strikes and failed early negotiations, Pakistan brokered a ceasefire on April 8. Talks moved to Islamabad and later Doha, mediated by Pakistan and Qatar. On June 17, Trump and Iranian President Pezeshkian signed the Islamabad Memorandum of Understanding, a document that established a 60-day window to negotiate a final deal while granting Iran immediate and substantial financial benefits. The concessions were striking. Oil sanction waivers, $24 billion in frozen assets released, and an end to the naval blockade. What the United States did not get was equally significant. No verified nuclear deal, no missile program limits, no proxy disarmament. As of early July, high-level talks have stalled. Iran is conditioning resumption on full implementation of MOU terms, and Iranian forces have resumed pressure on Hormuz shipping. But the timeline alone doesn't explain why Washington's position collapsed so quickly. For that, we need to go back much further. Iran's ability to threaten Hormuz has been a documented strategic asset since the tanker war of the 1980s. But for decades, it was treated as a theoretical threat, a red line Tehran would never actually cross because the economic consequences would damage Iran too. This single assumption shaped every round of nuclear negotiations from the JCPOA in 2015 onward. When Trump withdrew the United States from that agreement in 2018, it triggered a slow-motion strategic recalculation inside Tehran. Iran began stockpiling enriched uranium beyond JCPOA limits, expanding its missile arsenal and crucially testing the international community's response to partial Hormuz disruptions in 2019. Each time, the world expressed alarm, then accommodated. Meanwhile, Gulf states invested in bypass infrastructure. Saudi Arabia expanded its east-west pipeline to the Red Sea. The UAE developed Fujairah as an alternative oil export terminal. But these alternatives covered only a fraction of normal Hormuz volumes. The pressure point remained. When the IAEA declared Iran non-compliant in June 2025 and Israel launched its first strikes, Tehran drew a direct and dangerous lesson. The threat to Hormuz had not been neutralized. It had been preserved. Its nuclear sites were vulnerable. Its leadership was exposed. But the one weapon that mattered most remained fully intact. So when full-scale war arrived in February 2026, Iran didn't hesitate. For the first time in history, Tehran actually closed the strait, not as a bluff, but as a deliberate economic weapon. The move analysts had theorized about for 40 years had finally been tested, and the world discovered something uncomfortable. The bypass pipelines, the strategic petroleum reserves, and the overwhelming American naval presence were not enough to make the global economy indifferent to Hormuz. This is where the story most people are telling gets the causality backwards. Iran didn't close Hormuz because it was losing. It closed Hormuz because it had been planning for exactly this moment for years. With that foundation in place, we can now examine what Iran actually revealed. Iran entered the 2026 conflict understanding something Washington appeared to underestimate, that the United States had two distinct vulnerabilities that had nothing to do with military capability. The first was economic. The Strait of Hormuz closure caused the largest single-month oil price increase on record. U.S. strategic petroleum reserves were already strained from prior drawdowns. Domestic gasoline prices rose sharply, directly pressuring Trump's political standing ahead of midterm elections. Trump was candid about this calculus: dwindling reserves, rising inflation, and electoral risk forced a choice between prolonging the war and striking a deal. Iran had correctly read that America's tolerance for economic pain was finite in a way that Tehran's, having already endured severe sanctions for years, was not. The asymmetry was structural. Iran's economy had been reorganized around survival under sanctions. Its population had adapted to scarcity. Tehran's leadership faced domestic criticism, but not from voters demanding cheaper fuel. It faced criticism from hardliners demanding it extract more concessions from Washington. America, by contrast, faced an electorate that had grown accustomed to relatively stable energy prices and had little appetite for economic sacrifice in pursuit of abstract foreign policy goals. The second vulnerability was embedded within the negotiations themselves. The U.S. team, led by Vice President Vance alongside Stephen Witkoff and Jared Kushner, faced immediate criticism from analysts for lacking experienced nuclear negotiators. More critically, the team entered talks with maximalist public demands: unconditional surrender, zero enrichment, complete dismantlement of Iran's nuclear infrastructure that left virtually no room for the sequenced face-saving compromises that successful nuclear diplomacy historically requires. These pronouncements may have satisfied domestic political audiences, but they created a negotiating trap. Any significant compromise would appear as capitulation. Iran, by contrast, arrived in Islamabad having already internally resolved its red lines. It would discuss enrichment limits under specific conditions, but it would never surrender the program entirely. The ballistic missile program and support for regional proxy forces were treated as entirely non-negotiable and outside the scope of any agreement. This asymmetry and flexibility, Washington publicly committed to maximal outcomes, Tehran privately committed to preserving core capabilities, tilted the negotiating dynamic before substantive talks even began. Iran also leveraged its own internal political divisions as a negotiating asset. Pakistan's mediators reportedly spent as much time helping Iranian factions agree among themselves as they did bridging U.S.-Iran gaps. The hardliner Paydari Front publicly attacked President Pezeshkian and Foreign Minister Araghchi for conceding too much, which paradoxically strengthened the negotiators' hand by demonstrating to Washington that further American demands risked collapsing the talks entirely. The message was clear: push harder and you won't get a better deal, you'll get no deal and a return to hostilities. Iran also timed its concessions with surgical precision. The Hormuz closure was not lifted immediately upon ceasefire. It was held back as the primary bargaining chip for the MOU itself. Reopening the strait became the central transaction, and Iran extracted maximum value. Oil sanction waivers, $24 billion in frozen assets, released an end to the naval blockade. The core U.S. demands: verified denuclearization, missile program limits, proxy disarmament, were deferred to a 60-day negotiating window where, according to intelligence assessments, Iran had no intention of making significant concessions. What most people missed is that Iran didn't win at the negotiating table. It won before the table was even set by making the economic cost of continued war politically unsustainable for an American president facing a domestic audience. The implications of this dynamic extend well beyond the U.S.-Iran bilateral relationship, and that's what makes the outcome of this negotiation genuinely consequential for the entire regional and global order. The Islamabad Memorandum of Understanding has sent a set of strategic signals that will reverberate for years across multiple dimensions of international order. For Gulf states observing Washington's response, the conflict demonstrated that U.S. security guarantees have limits defined by American domestic economic tolerance, not just military capability. Regional actors Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar are now accelerating their own independent defense postures, diversifying security partnerships, and hedging against the possibility that American commitment may waver when economic costs escalate beyond politically sustainable thresholds. Iran, meanwhile, has emerged with a new strategic paradigm. It demonstrated that even a weakened post-war Islamic republic can extract favorable terms from the world's most powerful military, because it controls a choke point the global economy cannot bypass. Iran's push to institutionalize Hormuz transit fees, rejected by both the United States and Oman, but embedded in the MOU's deliberately ambiguous language, represents an attempt to formalize that leverage, permanently transforming a tactical wartime maneuver into a structural economic instrument. On the nuclear front, contradictions emerged immediately. The 60-day negotiating window began with both sides issuing incompatible public statements about what had already been agreed. Vice President Vance claimed Iran accepted the highest level of nuclear inspections long into the future. Iran denied this categorically. The U.S. stated frozen assets would be restricted to humanitarian and agricultural purchases. Iran insisted the $24 billion was unconditionally released. These contradictions are not merely rhetorical posturing. They reflect a fundamental gap between what each side needs to sell domestically and what was actually committed to on paper. Israel, excluded from the MOU negotiations, entirely declared publicly it was not bound by its terms and continued military operations in Lebanon, adding another destabilizing variable. Russia and China, which vetoed a UN Security Council resolution demanding guaranteed freedom of navigation through Hormuz, emerged from the crisis as structural beneficiaries. Higher energy revenues enhanced leverage over energy-dependent allies and demonstrated ability to shield Iran diplomatically at the international level. This is where everything changes, not just for Iran and America, but for every country watching how this confrontation ended and drawing its own conclusions about challenging U.S. coercive pressure. The question now is what comes next, and the range of plausible scenarios is wider and more dangerous than current optimism in Doha suggests. 4 scenarios are currently in play as the 60-day MOU window progresses. Scenario 1. Partial deal remains the most likely near-term outcome. Both sides agree on a framework resembling a modified JCPOA, enrichment capped at low levels IAEA, inspectors readmitted sanctions relief phased in gradually while missile programs and regional proxy networks remain entirely unaddressed. This resolves the immediate crisis without resolving the structural conflict. Scenario 2, collapse and renewed pressure, envisions Iran continuing to stonewall on the nuclear file. The 60-day window expires without agreement, and the United States re-implements sanctions and potentially the naval blockade. Iran retaliates with renewed Hormuz disruptions, restarting the cycle at a potentially higher level of intensity. Scenario 3, Iranian entrenchment assumes Iran uses the financial windfall from the MOU $24 billion in frozen assets plus resumed oil export revenues to stabilize its economy, rebuild military capacity, and enter final negotiations from a position of renewed strength, extracting further concessions or simply running out the clock. Scenario 4, Israeli escalation derails the process, accounts for Israel as an independent variable. Not bound by the MOU and deeply opposed to any agreement that leaves Iranian nuclear or missile infrastructure intact, Israel conducts independent military operations that fracture the negotiating framework entirely. Prime Minister Netanyahu has already stated publicly that Israel preserves complete freedom of action. Each of these scenarios carries different consequences for global energy markets, regional stability, and the long-term credibility of American coercive diplomacy. The path chosen in the next 60 days will shape the Middle East's strategic architecture for the decade ahead. Which brings us back to the question this documentary began with, and the strategic lesson that cuts underneath all the headlines. America's negotiating position collapsed, not because its military failed, but because Iran revealed that controlling a physical choke point is leverage. Military power cannot eliminate, only manage at enormous cost. The U.S. won the battlefield and lost the framework. Iran lost its supreme leader and its nuclear sites, yet gained $24 billion permanent oil sanction relief and a leverage model for future negotiations. The question is not whether America can destroy Iran's capabilities again. It clearly can. The question is whether the global economy will allow that to yield the diplomatic outcome Washington wants. Because if the answer is no, if the choke point is permanent leverage, then the last 3 months didn't end a crisis. They set the terms for the next one.